You want to say something?
Testing 1, 2, 3. I can hear some people, but I can't hear Greg. If you can hear me,
Same
just
way. I'm
let
the
me
same
know.
way.
Sorry, I came in muted because I jumped back. Okay, great. All right, I'm gonna get started here, and then as we go, we can just kind of other people can join in. And so real quick, if you guys, we'll do this like last time where we have folks kind of trying to raise their hand if we can to answer questions, just so it's not so chaotic, and otherwise basically remaining muted, because in a group this large you get echoes and weird stuff happening if there are a lot of people unmuted. So if you don't know how to raise your hand, if you just go to the participants tab at the bottom, you'll see a list of folks by your name. You'll see, if you like go over that, you can see a mute or more, and if you click on the more, there's like a drop down menu to raise your hand. So I'll be taking a look at all the participants and trying to make sure that I see if folks are raising their hand or not. Yeah, great, Kevin, see that, perfect. That's a good example. So yeah, we'll try to do that, and yeah, kind of like last time and like the times we've done before, we're just going to try to keep this pretty interactive, and yeah, with hearing from you guys, trying to learn a little bit about Proverbs and Ruth. So Kev, you can go to the next slide, which is, I think, a schedule. Let's see, maybe. Yep, there we go, perfect. All right, great. So yeah, so you can kind of see there, we have a little bit of a schedule listed there. So we've been going through up through this week topics in Proverbs. So before that, we were looking kind of more generally at the book of Proverbs and getting kind of an overview. Now we're looking at topics in Proverbs. You can see we had March 15th through 22nd was the coronavirus meltdown. Last week, we looked at humility, pride, and discipline in Proverbs. This week, I think, is going to be our last week in the book of Proverbs. We're going to look at the topics of emotions and the inner life. Next week, I think we're actually going to take a break just because with all of this, Kevin, Andy, and I have not really been able to get on the same page about Sunday school, and we're team teaching this, and we're also probably transitioning to Ruth next week or next time we meet. So we want some time to be able to kind of confer and then get everything set up for Ruth. But I think we will be going certainly at least through the end of April, probably a little bit, maybe beyond that, to finish out Ruth. I think originally we had about 4 weeks in Ruth that we were gonna spend. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. So that April 19th is a little tentative, but I think next Sunday we won't be meeting for Sunday school class. But so that gives you a little bit of an idea of where we're headed. So you can go to the next slide, Kev. So this next slide is sort of review a little bit of what we've been talking about as we've been talking about topics in Proverbs. So when we did our introduction to Proverbs, we talked about how the organization of this book is a little bit different than just about any other book in Scripture. Maybe Ecclesiastes or Psalms is a little similar in that Proverbs oftentimes seem somewhat contextless, meaning that there's not necessarily a rhyme or a reason or a connection from one proverb to the next, especially in chapters 10 through 31. There are some times where there is kind of a connection between maybe 2 or 3 proverbs in a list, and commentators sort of disagree about how much connection exists between proverbs, but we're sort of siding with I guess in this case, probably the Tremper Longman school, I suppose you could say, who's a commentator on the book of Proverbs, in which he argues that especially chapters 10 through 31 there are some collections that you see, and there's some organization at times, but for the most part, one proverb after the next is somewhat unrelated, or not it's not tremendously needed to have the whole chapter or be like looking at the whole chapter of the Proverbs to understand. So Longman, at the end of his commentary, he actually creates an organization of Proverbs around different topics. And so we're kind of following his cue and picking different topics that he has put together in the book of Proverbs, and looking at them, because I think this has been a very helpful way for me to study Proverbs. This has been kind of a fun way, I think, for other folks to look at Proverbs and to think a little bit more systematically about what the book of Proverbs says about a given topic. If you've been, for the folks that have been in this class before, we don't necessarily get through a whole ton of Proverbs any given week, because there's just a lot to talk about in each of these Proverbs, which is good. So we don't necessarily we won't study all of these Proverbs that we have listed here, certainly. But I pick basically a handful from this list, and actually one or two beyond for us to talk about today. So you see that his list there. Those are directly from Longman's commentary. This actually will be recorded, so if you're interested in seeing this list again, feel free to check out that recording, and you can kind of look at these independently, or you can literally just copy and paste that to Bible Gateway, that list. It'll bring up all of the Proverbs from it. Like I said, we won't be covering all of them, but it is, I have found those to be somewhat helpful as I've kind of studied Proverbs and thought about things. So that being said, you can go to the next slide, Kev. So why are we talking about emotions in the interior life? So if you, so the slides weren't working last week, but if you had seen the slides last week, and if you remember the slides from the first 2 weeks on wealth and speaking and listening, Proverbs has a ton to say about those topics. There's probably, on speaking and listening, you could probably list over 100 Proverbs. There's a lot that they have to say. On emotions in the interior life, you probably even saw from the last slide, that list is a lot smaller. And so if Proverbs doesn't necessarily major in this, why are we talking about it? I think three reasons maybe. First of all, I think Proverbs actually talks a little bit more about emotions and the interior life than those lists maybe indicate. Obviously those lists are created by Longman, and he's sort of the arbiter of what gets in and what doesn't. I think there are actually a number of different Proverbs that you could put in there. Proverbs does talk a lot about, and I'm back, sorry. So Proverbs does talk a lot about anger, which we're going to talk about actually first today, but so you could include those sorts of Proverbs in there. And there are a number of others that I think, like we'll see, that maybe aren't included in that list that could be. So I actually do think this is a pretty significant topic in the book of Proverbs. I think Proverbs does talk about this a lot. Another reason why we were talking about this, I was meeting with one of my D groups on Thursday. Sorry, I'm just waiting. Okay, there we go. I was meeting with one of my D groups on Thursday, and there are two dental students that we meet together. And one of the things that one of the dental students was talking about was he thought that, he's a dental student and he's studying the body, he's studying biology, he's studying anatomy, and very, very complex structures. But he was saying that he was like, I think the most complicated thing in the world are human beings. Understanding human behavior, understanding human emotions, understanding human interior life is like way more complicated than anything that he's looked at in the physical or biological world. And I actually think that's largely right. I think human beings really, really are extremely complex. Sorry about that. Human beings are extremely complex, and we have a lot that there's a lot inside of us. There's a lot inside of other people that it's hard to discern, hard to understand. The human heart is like deep waters, and so I think gaining some wisdom in this area would be really, really helpful, because I think a lot of us struggle with understanding human emotions, understanding human interior life, whether our own or other people. This is one of the a lifelong learning kind of or skills that we can gain. So looking at Proverbs, looking at wisdom from there could be helpful. I think the other thing is, the other reason why I wanted to, the final reason why I wanted to look at this was because, you know, for a lot of modern life, we look at it and we compare it to the ancients, folks in biblical times, folks in, like, you know, just older times than us. And we see that in a lot of ways we've made a lot of progress, right? We have, our technological capabilities are much greater. Our medical abilities are much greater, right? We have all these kind of amazing things that probably many of the ancients wouldn't even have imagined would be possible. I mean, even us talking on Zoom is frankly pretty amazing. At the same time, we still have these issues of understanding the emotions and the interior life. Our culture today, and specifically my generation and the generation after me, Generation Z, I mean, we are in, to a large degree, as a generation, a mental health crisis. There's a lot of mental health issues. There's a lot of depression. There's a lot of anxiety. In a lot of ways, this is an area in which we could look back on the ancients and say they probably maybe had something that we don't right now, and it might actually be an opportunity for us to learn how to handle emotions, the interior life, from a book like Proverbs. The final thing that I'll say, and we'll get into this proverb as well, is the last reason why I want to do this is just Proverbs 18:14. And you can see right there on the screen: a man's spirit will endure in sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear? And you know, when I've asked this, when I've studied this proverb with other, like, small groups or other groups that I've been going through Proverbs with, I'll oftentimes pose a hypothetical to them, and I'll say, so, you know, imagine the person who is getting treatment for cancer, right? Who's in the chemotherapy ward, and they're in, but, you know, so they have this possibly terminal disease. They have this disease that's, you know, could kill them, right? But they have a good attitude. Versus the person whose life is to a large degree taken care of, whose physical health is doing pretty well, but who is severely depressed, who has a crushed spirit, who is in a better situation. It's been interesting to me to see the response of folks, which is that for the most part, almost everyone agrees that the person who is depressed is worse off than the person who is in the cancer ward that has a cheerful and good attitude. And I think this probably points to some degree the priority of the interior life, right? Like that, your spirit, your life can be fruitful, can be productive, even in the midst of sickness. But if you have lost the will to live, right? If you're stuck in this sort of almost maze of depression, it's unclear how you get out of it. It's unclear sometimes it's unclear how it even started necessarily. Other people don't know what to do with it. It's a really scary thing, honestly, to be in. And I think a lot of us are concerned about either our own mental health or those around us who we love, right? And I'm sure many of you have experienced, whether personally or with family members, something like this. And so there's a deep priority to the interior life, and the cultivation of the interior life, and our emotions. So that's what we're going to talk about today. That's why we're talking about emotions in the interior life. That's why we're ending Proverbs on this. So that being said, I've blabbed for long enough. Let's jump into the Proverbs. So Kev, if you can go to the next slide. So this first one I want to talk about is anger, and anger is actually, of all the emotions in the book of Proverbs that it talks about, anger is probably the one that's talked about most frequently. Well, let me just read both of these, and then we'll talk about the top one first. Proverbs 29:22 says this: "A man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much transgression." And then Proverbs 19:19 says this: "A man of great wrath will pay the penalty, for if you deliver him, you will only have to do it again." All right, so I want to start with the top one. We'll cover kind of both of these, and we might actually spend a little bit of time, a decent amount of time on anger. So this says, "A man of wrath stirs up strife, and one given to anger causes much transgression." So last week we talked a little bit about this cat. And I'm back. Okay. So last week we talked a little bit about this category of folks called in Proverbs called the mockers, right? And you kind of see them show up over and over again. They have these sorts of general qualities. This is another type of fool that exists in the book of Proverbs, the man of wrath, or the angry man, or, there's different translations put it differently, but in the ESV it's the man of wrath. So I'm curious, as you guys think about this, who is the man of wrath? In other words, is there a distinction between someone who is an angry person and somebody who just gets angry occasionally? How would you think about that distinction? How would you kind of define that? Or do you think there is no distinction between someone who gets angry sometimes versus a man of anger or an angry person? What do you guys think? Jacob?
Well, I do apologize. Before we get to that, on our screen we have a mini window of participants blocking some of the verse. Is that showing up on YouTube?
Sorry. Yes, sorry. Kev, do you mind moving that? Actually, you can.
That's it. It's clear now.
Okay.
I can't move it on my screen. I don't know why.
Well, it just cleared on.
Oh, there we go.
Right.
Yeah, it just cleared off.
Clear to mine.
We're good now.
Okay. Well, to answer your question, think of someone who I would, just generally expect as a pattern, and moreover, I would expect them to get angry over things that I don't think are reasonable to get angry over. Yeah, so it has to do with regularity and the things that make them angry, and whether that really warrants it or not.
Yeah. So there's this kind of general pattern to an angry person. How many of you? I'm almost curious to hear if you guys have you guys known angry people that you would characterize as being angry? What were they like? Yeah. Sorry, did you guys hear my question? I get this, my internet connection is unstable.
I did, yeah.
Okay, all right, great.
We just got people raising their hands.
Okay, Anita Woolley, Bill, and...
Oh, great. Okay, I see it now. Yeah, Anita, go ahead.
I definitely think that there are some people who have a very strong sense of both needing things to be, what do I want to say? They need to be respected, and they need to have everything be like absolutely fair or to pay back, quickly if they think if score is not even, in that very moment. And so I think, kind of scorekeepers, if you will, people who are walking around keeping score and evening for themselves through their doing. And so I think the question was, what do you think of as an angry person? And I think it's somebody very focused. Who's focused, I guess, on a justice, if you will, but it's a justice that they're part of delivering.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. That's good.
You need that background of yours. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Good lesson this morning.
Talks about the 7 capital vices, and as you know, wrath is one of them, and she draws along a lot of desert and kind of that into modern context, but like you mentioned, justice, anger being the reaction to injustice, and that receive justice against ourselves in ways that we shouldn't. We get angry for bad reasons. That's kind of like the pattern of the vice of wrath.
Hmm. So this is really good. I hear you, Kevin and Anita, you're sort of getting at kind of my next question, which was sort of like, why would someone be an angry person? So talking about sort of this sense of justice, that sort of thing. Why do people become angry people?
There is a secondary emotion. That example of someone who has this being wronged, that's why they exhibit anger.
This is Margie Hill. You can see our picture. Child abused and over and over again is made to feel that they are not allowed to be angry. It's just building that anger up. And then when they become adults, there are triggers that trigger that anger. So I think we need to be careful about just not writing people off that become angry. We need to take the time to look, see why they may become angry.
I mean, Jesus got angry, but he used his anger appropriately when he cleared the temple.
Yeah, that's really good. Margie and Jeannie, you're getting at something, another question, which is there seems like there's some sort of appropriate time for anger. It's not that anger in and of itself is always bad. So I guess this might be a little bit of an esoteric question, but what even is anger? Like when we talk about anger, what are we talking about? Yeah.
Well, the angry person usually cannot define what he's angry about.
Yeah, he's just generally angry. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would rather deal with a man of wrath than I would with a man of anger.
Yeah. Yeah, readers, Matt or Emily, go ahead.
Hi, Greg, it's Emily. Come back to you. I was your original question. The difference between someone who might feel anger and someone who is perpetually angry. I think there's some good things that have been said already. Regulate their emotions well. They get flooded and they just get overtaken by those emotions. And someone who might not know how to control or regulate and like what they do with those emotions may be characterized as someone who is more angry of a person and like more habitually kind of explodes or has rage or wrath or things like that. Whereas I think anger, I mean, it's an emotion, and I think it is normal to feel anger, and there are times where it makes a lot of sense that someone might be feeling angry. So it's more about one's own ability to notice what they're feeling and what they do with that and how they process it, and being able to regulate those emotions rather than let it take control of them, and then that kind of they get caught up with or carried away or ran away with that emotion, and that comes out in negative ways with how they treat themselves or others. So those are just some of my thoughts.
Yeah, that's really good.
Well, while we got the floor, let me tack on to that. There's a flip side to that too. This map. So there are some folks that can't regulate their anger, so it just sort of explodes all the time. Even when they have like a small amount of anger, they have like a disproportionately huge response. Right? That's one type of angry person that can't regulate it. Gets out way too much. Then there's another type of dysregulated emotion where people internalize it too hard. They don't let it happen. That's another unhealthy state. And I think we see that sadly more in our society. We're so prone to things like depression and anxiety because our culture very much is one where it's not accepted to share your feelings, when in fact that's what any of us need. We need to share in healthy and healthy ways, including anger. Actually a good thing. It tells us that something is not the way it should be. A point in the world that we need to work on and think about. But when we dysregulate it so it explodes, that's not good. And when we internalize it, causes us all kinds of emotional, psychological, mental, and even physiological problems, which is
As a nurse, I've seen many people who have had frontal lobe injuries, who have then an inability to control their emotions. And so they are going to live their life like that. So how do we deal with them? How do we deal in a loving manner with them? But the other thing is Ephesians 4 says, be angry and sin not.
Mm-hmm.
So there does have to be some discernment in how you deal with anger.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I hear, Margie, I'm glad you jumped in, because I was, while Matt was talking, I was thinking this is sort of what Margie was talking about, right? With abused children who don't express their anger, becomes this internalized thing that results in all kinds of bad things. And I think you guys have been doing a really good job of getting at this idea of what is anger. I think the best definition that I ever heard of anger that I've used kind of ever since I heard it was from Tim Keller, which, you know, of course, that's he's always my my go-to for if you're thinking about something wise, go to Keller. But Keller says that anger is love in motion, and so the idea is that if you are angry about something, it's because you love something that is being attacked, right? You love something that is being threatened. And so the love that you feel for that thing when it is threatened is expressed by you getting angry, by you seeking to defend it, by you seeking to care for it, to keep it from being attacked, right? And so sometimes, and this gets at this idea of anger is not always a bad thing. Sometimes the thing that you love that needs to be defended truly is good, right? It is something that should truly be loved, that should truly be defended, that actually to not be angry about it would be frankly sin, right? Like to just not care at that point would be a bad thing. And so Proverbs is going to present to us a notion, and I'll kind of say this right at the end. There's a final proverb that I want to give, but it's not necessarily that we have no anger. It's not necessarily that we are angry people, as we've been talking about, this man of wrath, but it's that we're slow to anger. Slow to anger is the path to wisdom when it comes to anger. It's that you don't have a trigger finger, but when you are angry, it's for good reasons. You're angry about the right thing, and you're angry about it in the right way. So I want to jump back to the proverb real quick, 29:22, before we move on to 19:19, to talk about one more thing. It says in the second half of this proverb that a man of wrath, a man of anger, causes much transgression. And I'm curious why you all think that somebody who is angry, somebody who is given to anger like this, would commit a lot of sins. Like, why is there this relationship between anger and a man of wrath and just the commission of many, many sins? Tim, go ahead.
Can you ask the question one more time? I was actually on the last one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So it was. I was just saying, why does someone who is given to anger, why does that create so many transgressions? Why does that result in so many sins? Somebody being an angry person. How does that come about? How do they just go about sinning a ton?
Well, for me, I think an angry person is a person who is really concentrated on self. And everything is not from self is almost an offense. So anyone's opinion, it can be perceived as a trans against person's self. And so they're in this perpetual state of being wronged and being like they're treated unfairly. And so when you go through life feeling that way all the time, you're going to lash out and cause sin.
Yeah, and there's a sense in which anger is you said it there, right? That there's a when you're angry about something you love being attacked, right? And so you feel justified in whatever response is necessary to defend that thing that you're trying to defend. And so what happens is that the ends justify the means at that point. And when the ends justify the means, what happens is you see a ton of sins, a ton of transgressions start to explode from someone, because because they will always feel that the results, the defense of the thing that they're loving, whatever it takes to get to that result is whatever it takes. And if that means committing a lot of sins, if that means attacking someone unnecessarily, if that means blowing up over and over at various folks, then that's just what it takes. And I feel deeply justified in all of those responses. And so there's a sense of almost Emily was talking about it a little bit earlier, but there's almost a sense in which you're sort of blind to these certain sorts of notions when you're a man of wrath. You're sort of just taken over. It's habitual. It's something that you're not really thinking about too much. You're just kind of operating in. It's almost like being drunk a little bit, where you just don't even really know what's happening. You're seeing red, and you've got to just attack the thing in front of you, regardless of whether or not that's the right thing to do. Yeah, Jacob.
Greg?
Wait, someone else want to say something?
This is Bruce Hemphill. Just a thought. Your question was about transgressions of the angry man, but the verse actually says in the ESV, one given to anger causes much transgression. It seems like it might be other people who are doing this thing.
Yeah, let me
The NIV says that a hot-tempered one commits many sins.
Yeah, let me actually, you guys can keep talking. Let me real quick look up in the commentary what Longman says in his translation of it, to kind of get clarity on that, because that's a good question, Bruce. Jacob, go ahead.
Okay. Well, we've been talking a lot about anger and wrath, this response to protect something you love, and I do think that's rightfully so. One definition of wrath also just has a very strong judicial component to it, paying back. Because we're told throughout Scripture that the blood of Jesus saves us from the coming wrath of God, and that's not sinful. That is God's wrath against sin, a judicial response to our sin as a punishment, as a consequence. So, by definition, anyone acting on wrath for themselves on their own is saying, I have the right to pay them back for this. But by definition, Scripture says, wrath is mine, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. So anyone acting on wrath is stepping out of their bounds.
Yeah, there's a degree to which we can take the position, or try to take the position of judge. We judge imperfectly, right? Because we don't have perfect knowledge. God judges perfectly because He does have perfect knowledge of everything. And so there definitely, I think, the New Testament says, and you're absolutely right, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And the idea behind that is that we don't fully understand what has been happening in that person's life, what's happening in our lives. We don't have the perspective to be able to step back and judge really fairly. And so I think while we are called at times we're called to call sin sin, right, and to respond to it and try to defend against it, right, and oppose sin, we need to be very we need to be very careful about how we actually go about really judging other people and trying to kind of create this sort of sense of final judgment and committing and trying to sort of like even the scales in some sense, as opposed to leaving it to the Lord in the end, who is the only true and just, fully just kind of judge. Okay, so I want to move on to the next proverb because this is really good, but I'm also cognizant of time. Okay, so this is Proverbs 19:19. I chose the ESV because why did I choose the ESV? It is a closer translation to the original Hebrew. It might obfuscate a little bit of what the proverb is actually saying. I'll give you. So first, let me just reread the ESV. A man of great wrath will pay the penalty, for if you deliver him, you will only have to do it again. For those of you who have the NIV, here's what the NIV says: a hot-tempered person must pay the penalty. Rescue them, and you will have to do it again. So that's probably closer to what the proverb is actually getting at. Tremper Longman, in his commentary, he gives this translation: people of great wrath carry around punishment. If you rescue them, you will have to do so again. And so the idea of this verse, of this proverb, is that you can think about it as almost like the sword of Damocles is hanging above a man of great wrath, right? There is punishment that is coming upon this person, right? And if you try to rescue this person, if you just try to take away those consequences, you're going to have to do it again. And so the question that I had with this proverb, I think a lot of you guys probably recognize this to some degree, that there are people that have to sort of face consequences. Sorry, you probably recognize that there are people that have to face consequences. A lot of times, the way in which we talk about those people, though, is in the context of addiction, right? As we look at both of these proverbs, probably as you kind of sort of start to analyze their actions, what you start to see is that a lot of this fits a model of addiction, right? So we talk about, especially substance abuse addicts, needing to kind of hit rock bottom, right? Like, so you need to sort of feel the consequences fully of your actions before you can really change, right? Or there's this notion that this person is going about stirring up much transgression, and they're sort of blind to it, right? Like an addict is blind to his own addiction, and like in the 12-step program, the first step is admitting that you're an addict, right? That's a hard thing to admit to. It's hard to stop justifying. It's hard to stop pretending that you're something that you're not, and just admit that. And so if anger starts to fit the model of addiction, what, I guess, does that, what do we do with that, I guess? How is anger addictive? How do we fight? How do we actually use anger in a way that is good instead of in a way that is addictive like this? What do you guys think? Oh, sorry, I don't have my participant thing up. Kevin, go for it.
Oh yeah, Greg, I actually looked up the previous proverb.
Oh, you did. I'm sorry. Thank you.
So
yeah.
my hand is not raised for this current one.
No, go ahead. Tell us what.
So yeah. So just looking at this interlinear for 22, the phrase itself is a man of wrath is in transition. It's a zero copula. that's all I had.
I'm sorry, I literally just missed the key portion of it. But I had when I looked up in Longman, his translation is "angry people stir up conflict, the wrathful much offense." So that's kind of the idea there. So I think probably it could be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
The wrathful stir up offense from others. They also stir up offense. They also commit offenses, kind of thing. It seems like the translation can kind of go either way, or into both. Yeah. Tim, go ahead.
I guess the question was, how do you not sin? In your
Yeah,
anger?
essentially, like, what if this is habitual? How do we avoid this? How do we treat anger in a way that is good? I guess. How do we use it?
Well, I mean, I think anger can be good. Obviously, that's how major change in society happens, when people get angry. I think he got rid of child anger, or when people became angry that was in danger. Hopefully the same systemic prejudice, race prejudice and things like that. But I think it gives us opportunity to communicate if we choose to communicate better. So when people get angry, they tend on if they do well, if they communicate well.
Yeah, and a lot of that communication comes from the skill of communication is both a technical skill, right? You can learn different communication techniques, and probably a lot. I apologize for my internet connection. It's a technical skill, and probably a lot of you have had interaction with programs that teach you how to talk to other people when you're angry. But it's also an emotional skill, right? Where you actually you need to be able to be angry but not sin, right? Be angry and recognize what you're angry at, why you're angry at it, and communicate that in a way that is that doesn't depersonalize the other and kind of destroy them. Yeah. Last question on anger. We've talking about how this is anger is sort of blinding. You don't necessarily know that you're an angry person, right? They're given to much transgression. They kind of seeing red. We, again, I want to be careful because we oftentimes read these proverbs as if we are not the angry person, right? That we are the person who is calm and cool and collected. But I'm curious to know what would be the markers? How would you know if you are a person of wrath? How would you know if you are a person who is given to great anger? What are the markers? How do you actually discern this? Yeah.
Margie again.
Yeah.
You asked the question, how does this compare to addiction? The person that is addicted doesn't have any, he can't see himself as addicted. He needs help. So an angry person may not be able to be objective about anger. He needs to have help, and he won't get help if the person is just yelling back. It needs to be somebody that comes in when he's not angry and says, okay, let's look at this objectively. You are a Christian. How are you going to ask for God's help? Do you want God's help? I'm willing to help you. Would you be able to accept my help? But the person himself, left alone, I don't think can be objective enough to deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we definitely need brothers and sisters in Christ to tell you that you're an angry person. Those of you who are married, I don't know if this has been your experience, but I have never, before marriage, I never thought of myself as an angry person, and I don't know that I would still be characterized by sort of habitual anger, but I didn't realize, I guess, how much anger I had until I was in a very, very close sort of intimate relationship with Jenna, and her seeing me kind of every day and the patterns that exist, I started to recognize the ways in which, wow, I actually am more angry than I thought I was, I suppose, or I'm more given to anger than I thought I was. And so that sort of the reflective nature of others around us is pretty key in being able to kind of listen to them. Yeah. Okay, that's really good. I'm going to leave anger there for now, and we're going to go on because we should move on. So Kev, you can go to the next slide, which is hope. This is this next proverb is a pretty famous one. It's one of the it's a descriptive proverb in the sense that it's not necessarily giving you a here's what you should do in this situation. It's more describing here's what the world is kind of like. And it says this: hope deferred makes the heart sick, but desire fulfilled is a tree of life. So we've already talked about at the beginning how hard it is to sustain a crushed spirit, and I'm going to kind of assume that that's something that we want to avoid by and large, is a crushed spirit. So I guess, like, as you guys think about the nature of hope and how you hopes deferred versus hopes fulfilled, you probably have thought a little bit about what it is that you're sort of hoping in, what your desires are, what you're kind of aiming for. I'm curious though, how changeable are hopes? Meaning, like, let's say that you observe that you're hoping in something, maybe great wealth, that you maybe don't want to be hoping in anymore. You think like that's kind of a false hope. That's something that will probably be deferred. That might make kind of my heart sick. That might not be something that I should rely on. How malleable are our hopes? How would you actually, can you kind of like change what your heart desires? Can you change what you're hoping in? And if so, how would you go about doing that? Yes, readers.
Readers.
Oh, you did notice. So the thought I had about changing your hopes, I think you have an ability, whether you recognize it or not, to influence your desires by what you spend your mental time telling on. And I think that's why there's so many exhortations in scripture as practices in the church to regularly time in the Word of God. I reflect back on the signs of we all don't want to around hypocrites who are pretending something they're not, but there's a pretending which is the good pretending, which actually leads to the thing itself. So even if you don't feel like spending time in scripture, even if you don't want to spend time in prayer or spend time with the Lord, by doing that, you will slowly change your heart to the point where it is your desire to spend time with the Lord, to spend time reflecting on his word, to spend time in prayer, loving him, and that eventually leads to helping and loving others as well. I think that's kind of how the hopes of the heart are sort of slowly changed over time, by repeatedly dwelling on the things that you want to put your hope in, most especially the Lord.
That's good. So there's habits, there's patterns of life that shape the desires of your heart. It's not necessarily something that like you just can switch on and off easily, but it's sort of more of a longitudinal. If you're kind of focused on this thing, your desires and your attitudes start changing. Yeah, Tim.
I think sometimes I have unfair expectations of people or situations that I really have to modify or I'm going to go insane. You know, my job is not always going to be this great job. You know, sometimes it's going to be really, really hard. My marriage, sometimes it's going to be really, really hard. And a lot of times I'm putting expectations on my wife to be perfect or to have the right thing to say that touches me or reaches me or whatever. And that's not fair for me to do that to her. And so I have to change those expectations. And so when I think of hope deferred, I think of, you know, kind of where am I finding my hope? Am I expectations? I need to change that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, you're sort of, you can be confronted with the nature of life, and right, sometimes that sort of defers your hope, sometimes that maybe realigns your hope and says like, this was not maybe a great hope, or this was not a realistic hope. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Zach, go ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah, so this is kind of in line with what a number of people have said, but I think it was a Tim Keller sermon when he's talking about idols, as people were always hoping in something, right? And those hopes are really in ourselves and find justification for ourselves. And his kind of like test that he referenced was, what do you think about before you fall asleep at night? Like when you're stuff for the day, you haven't yet fallen asleep, your head hit the pillow. What's that you are thinking often at that time? And that kind of test for me was super interesting, because kind of looking back and a lot of my life, the different things that at different points of my life were kind of my self-righteousness, like those were the things that more often than not I was thinking about, whether or not a career or whether or not it was some kind of thing that I was trying to achieve. For periods of time, it was really well defined by that kind of test, and it was very much it was hope. And I think it relates to the anger proverb as well, because as I think you said, when those things, anger is that love in motion, and whatever we're loving, whenever it gets threatened, that's what we're going to get really, really mad about. And it's whether or not, you know, is it a self-righteous anger because we have some kind of idolatrous thing that's being threatened, or is it really, you know, something that's greater than ourselves?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. I think that gets at something else that I was thinking about for this this proverb, which is that both you and Tim were kind of referencing, to some degree, hopes that maybe you're well, first, that it's just sort of hard to figure out sometimes what it is that you're actually hoping in, right? Like if I just ask you the question, like, what are you hoping in, right? Maybe you have like, I don't know, like a 5 or 10 year career plan kind of thing, or like plan for your life. So some folks have those kinds of things. But I think the vast majority of folks aren't maybe all the time aware of what is the thing that I am hoping in, or what are the things that I really am hoping in. So Zach, you talked a little bit about this test that Keller presents, which is sort of, what are you thinking about when your head hits the pillow? How else do you guys think we could start to discern what it even is that we're hoping in, what it is that we desire? Yeah, go ahead, Jeannie or Bill.
Hey guys, this is Bill Griffith. I want to say I've always been a dreamer, and I have a lot of hopes. And as I look back, God has surprised me in wonderful ways. Many years ago, I knew I wanted to leave my hometown, but I didn't think, oh yeah, I want to move to Pittsburgh. You know what I mean? But God surpasses my hopes. And I had this, I'm hopeful I want to adopt kids, but God brought that. So I'm always going to be home, and I'm always going to be a dreamer, but I've always given God the permission to surprise me and surpass hopes and my dreams.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. There's a way in which you can have these hopes and plans with kind of an open hand a little bit, recognizing that you might want these things, but the Lord has sort of superiority, I guess, in the final answer of whether or not we're going to get them or how we're going to get them. Yeah, yeah, that's really good. How else do you guys discern sort of what your hope is, or what that is? Like, do you feel like you know what it is that you're desiring, what it is that you're hoping? Yeah, Kev, go ahead.
So this is maybe pretty relevant for our current situation. What are the things that you were planning in, if you know they're not going to happen, or if you think they might not happen, what would disappoint you most? I think about this because my fiance are planning our wedding, and which of the aspects of it, like for instance, I could say that that Sarah is not necessarily our honeymoon getting canceled, but the prospect of not being able to have like a real reception like people customarily have because of coronavirus is weighing hard on her. So
Yeah, and this is interesting. Like sometimes we don't fully understand what our hopes are until they're sort of lost, right? Or until they're affected. We don't know how much we're trusting. We don't know how much we're like desiring them. Yeah, yeah. There's when I work with in Bible studies, we talked about hope. One of the things, as I've been talking with folks about them, is that oftentimes, so like I said, some people have these sorts of 5 or 10 year plans that have their life to a large degree planned out. But most people don't operate that way. Most people kind of have something like a narrative that exists that to a large degree our culture has given us, right? That like, here's kind of the goal of life. You sort of move through, you find a good job, you get married, you settle down, maybe you have kids. You're sort of, it's sort of a model of achievement of these sort of benchmarks of adulthood, and even just of like self-actualization, right? Becoming kind of the best person you possibly can be. And oftentimes, again, not all the things are bad inherently at all. But oftentimes it's more of what we have is more of just kind of a picture that we have in our head, or it's like the essence of a feeling than it is necessarily like a big plan that we have for all of these things. And so a lot of times we don't fully recognize our own hopes until God kind of moves in some ways, maybe against them, maybe for them. We don't recognize how much we're sort of resting in them. And so I think this is part of the reason why, what Matt was saying, it's so important to be kind of diligently practicing spiritual disciplines, right? Because creating habits of following after the Lord, because to a large degree, the trajectory of our lives and our hopes, it's sort of background. It's not necessarily something that we like pick every day. We're not having an existential crisis every 5 minutes, wondering like, why am I doing everything that I'm doing? And like, how is this all affecting me, right? We mostly just move through life under the assumption that we're getting somewhere that we want to be. And I think like until that is upset, until the apple cart is kind of pushed over, we don't fully recognize the degree to which we've been trusting in those things. Or if we choose to like continue to follow after the Lord day by day and pursue Him, then we might actually get a chance to like recognize how I think we need to recognize how we need to recognize how we interact with one another, and how we see our hopes. Okay, Kev, let's go to the next slide, which is we'll probably end on this one. This is a weird one. and I wanted to include it because it's just really, it's an interesting proverb. I call this transparency. We can certainly talk about that. I think that's generally what this proverb is getting at, but we can talk about it. It says this: even in laughter, the heart may ache, and the end of joy may be grief. Before I make any assumptions about what this proverb says, I'm curious to hear from you guys. What do you think this proverb is getting at? What does this actually mean? Yeah, Jacob.
So I'm sure we've all 100% of us been in that situation. Oh, hey, how are you? I'm good. How are you? Really?
Jacob, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, just, you can basically go from there. We cover up all the time problems that we have and things that we're facing, even with people we're close to, because we don't know how it's going to play over. What will they say? How will they respond? And then iterate that a few times down the road, and then what it'll look like then. And it's, oh my goodness, it's really sad. And yeah, people cover up all the time if they're feeling bad because they don't want to make it worse.
Yeah, Jacob, I was thinking about you when I was when I was writing the questions for this proverb, because I remember doing our when we first met, we had many discussions about sort of the rules of social order and how do you think about these sorts of "how are you" and "I'm doing good" kind of responses. These sort of like
a little bit since then, but I have a general idea of,
yeah.
it's a good thing.
Yeah. It definitely can be. Yeah, that's good. Anita, go ahead.
Actually, one word that came to mind for the first phrase in that proverb is Facebook. Because it seems to me like, people post these like very cheerful, beautiful pictures of their life. And, and there are all these studies showing how people who spend a lot of time on Facebook are actually quite depressed because it's, it's just sort of only showing one dimension, right? And so I think this is just hinting and I guess building on what Jacob's saying, the multidimensional aspect of our experience. And so it's never just laughter, if you're a normal human being.
Yeah.
I have an example. This is Margie. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead, Margie.
Okay. This is taken from my nursing experience too. I worked in an ICU for 20 years. And when we were, say, doing a code on a person whose heart had stopped beating and everything, and we were defibrillating and so on, sometimes the only way we could stand to deal with that situation was to make a joke. And at the bottom of it was this deep fear or ache that this person was not actually going to come back. But we had to have some release for that emotion. And then the end of joy is the other end of that. You can be in a life that is just wonderful and you have a wonderful relationship, say, with your spouse. And then the end of life comes and you are dealing with grief because that joy has turned to mourning. So that's how I look at it.
That's really good. Yeah. Readers, go ahead.
So I had maybe an alternative interpretation of this a little bit. So you were going in the direction of, even though things really like bad may be happening, we might kind of gloss over it with like kind of or whatever. Thinking in another direction, there are certain types of activities that people think are fun, good at the time, but in the end, all they do is cause you grief, right? I mean, I think like people going out or like partying or like doing things that are self-destructive but feel good at the time. You can come up with any number of activities that fall into that category, but that might be another way you could say, hey, in the end, these things that you think are joy or that are causing you laughter now cause you heartache in the long run.
Yeah, that's good. I remember years ago reading a study of folks at like freshmen at college parties that the numbers were staggering. It was like 90% of the people don't actually want to be there, but they just didn't really have another idea of what to do. So they just ended up there, right? Yeah, that's really good. Daniel, go ahead.
Well, you know, when people ask how you do it, I don't always think that they really want to know all the details of your life. But, you know, my situation right now is such that when somebody asks me how I'm doing, I have to decide whether they really want to know about what's going on with me and like, or do they just want to know, you know, how do I feel about everything in general, you know? Yeah, because the immediate thing when you talk to somebody, how you doing? You say, okay, fine. You know, well, in reality, you know, you have a loved one in a home that you cannot see now, and talking to them by phone is virtually impossible because of their ability to dial you out, or when they do get, you can't face, so you make a sentence out of a word. They're in their level of that just makes no sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, how you decide people really want to know when they say how you doing?
Right. How honest is that question? Yeah, that's good. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to mention maybe some biblical examples of this in terms of like aspects of life that are, you know, so beautiful and so meaningful, but oftentimes have a very, you know, destructive aspect just because, you know, Proverbs describes the way things should be, but Ecclesiastes says that, you know, that's not always the case. So, for example, we were talking about how hope deferred makes the heart. So she really wanted a son. She, you know, said, "Give me children, you know, or I'll die." And finally, I guess her second son was Benjamin. You know, in laughter, you know, she finally has Benjamin, but it ends up killing her. Right. And we see a similar thing in Ezra, where finally they rebuild the temple, and the people are cheering like crazy. Yay, we built the temple! But the older folks are crying because this temple is nothing compared to what it used to be. So like even in those like most momentous occasions of life, just because things aren't always the way they should be, that there can really be this grief and this despair.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. It is funny. This is one of those proverbs that I do feel like maybe it feels Ecclesiastes like. It feels like it belongs to the book of Ecclesiastes more, kind of as you said. And yeah, I think even the reference to hope deferred makes the heart sick is a great one, because there's a degree to which a lot of our hopes are ultimately, you know, like, frankly, just a lot of our hopes are deferred, right? Because of death, because of the existence of a life in which that will end, right? Ultimately, oftentimes we don't get, at least in this life, fully the hopes that we desire, and so there's a degree of dourness, I guess, to life that can exist. So I'm very aware of our time. What I want to ask in the last question for this is, what do we do with this proverb? Meaning, how does this make us more wise to interact with other people? How should we absorb this proverb? How does absorbing this proverb change the way, influence the way we interact with other people, and maybe even with our own kind of emotional life? Yeah, Jacob, go ahead.
So there are two ways to look at it. There's one about yourself and one about other people. As far as other people are concerned, there's something going on under the surface. Be patient with people. And this really ties back to the anger stuff too. It's not just the immediate present. Virtually always there's some much bigger story that led up to today. It's not just, you know, your boss blew up because a paper was 5 minutes late, whatever. There's something that made this person who they are today. And just try to be understanding, try to be patient with that. Even when the time is right, try to be inquisitive about it. And as far as you yourself, don't feel guilty about it. Don't feel guilty about pain. Don't feel guilty about grief. Even don't feel guilty about the emotion of wrath and anger. Those are not signs that you did anything wrong. That does not mean you've committed some grave sin if you're carrying grief. And understand that there are healthy outlets for that. There are ways that you can handle it. You can talk about that, and people who are being the body of Christ will understand that.
That's good. That's really good. Zach, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Oh man, Greg, a lot of pressure, man. So this is a line from someone who's a lot smarter than me, so that's safer than saying anything that I might have thought of. But I heard from someone who I was talking to a year and a half ago. I think I was probably complaining about something, looking for someone to agree with me and tell me how right I was about something that I was, I don't know, maybe angry about. And she said, our feelings are real, but they are not reliable. And at the time, I just thought that was total nonsense. And as I've been thinking about it more, I think it really applies to a number of things we've talked about here, whether it's anger, whether it's, the end of a life of joy that could be filled with grief. Like, you can have a period of intense grief at the end of a joyous life, and that is so real, and that's something that we can embrace, and I think we don't have to be scared talking about with other people, but it's not a reliable indicator for what that really means about ourselves and what our true identity is and where that lies. And that kind of distinction, I think, is helpful, like, to be able to rest in the fact that those emotions, they can be real, but they are not the true navigators for how we should be evaluating the world around us.
That's really good. Yeah, that's really good. Okay, it's 11:02, so I have to call this. Sorry, I do love spending time with you all, and and this has been really fun. But let me close this in prayer, and then we can get to worship. Father, thank you so much for your wisdom. Lord, thank you that you treat us with wisdom, Lord, that you are slow to anger, that you are just, and Lord, that you are constant and caring and recognize who we are. Lord, I pray that more and more we would search after you, the knower and lover of our hearts. And Lord, that we would rest in our relationship with you and who you have called us to be, who you have made us to be. And Lord, live out of that and let our hearts be hoping in you. Father, I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Wonderful work, Greg. Loved it.
Thanks, Jacob.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.